His daughters. He married his daughters. While the sun scorched the holy city of Akhetaten, the pharaoh Akhenaten defied not just tradition, but nature itself. In alabaster palaces cast in gold and silence, he summoned his own blood to his bed, not out of lust, but for something darker. Power, legacy, eternity. The man who claimed to speak with the Aten, the blinding sun disk, carved his will into stone, unshaken by mortal law. But why? What poison brews in the mind of a god-king who looks at his daughter and sees a queen and a womb? One by one, they were lifted from childhood into the role of wives, bound not by love, but by decree. The temples whispered, the priests recoiled in fear, and history tried to forget. But the stones remember, the paintings remember. Their eyes, wide and painted alive, scream from cracked tomb walls. What truth hides behind their painted smiles? Before Egypt was scorched by scandal, there was harmony or the illusion of it. Akhenaten was not born twisted, he was crafted, molded by centuries of divine rulership, broken dynasties, and the crushing weight of expectation. As a prince, he was sickly, strange, too quiet for the court's liking, too curious for the priests. They whispered that his body bent like reeds in the Nile, soft, fragile. But inside that delicate frame, something fierce simmered, a vision, a hunger. He would tear down the gods of his ancestors, rip Amun from his throne, and crown a god of light in his place, Aten, the sun itself. But monotheism had a price. Old Kotsti slow, their worshippers slower, and in the vacuum left by the shattered temples, Akhenaten built something monstrous, not just a religion, but a dynasty of mirrors, where every reflection looked eerily like himself, even the ones who called him father. It began with Akhetaten, his firstborn. Her name meant beloved of Aten, but fate had cursed her instead. She stood at the center of a new world, draped in white linen, adorned with sacred gold, a bride to a man twice her age and her own blood. She did not cry, she dared not. Behind her, the sun blazed unnaturally bright, as though Aten watched, unblinking, and around them, ceremony blurred into silence. The people cheered hollow cheers, knelt on aching knees, dared not speak what they saw. A royal wedding, yes, but also a funeral, the death of innocence, the birth of something unspeakable. And Akhenaten, radiant in his divine madness, smiled, not with love, with triumph, with delusion. From that moment, the boundary between sacred and profane dissolved like sand in rain. One daughter became two became three, and yet Egypt did not rise. It grew quieter, as if the gods themselves were holding their breath. In the hush of twilight, behind stone walls painted with divine radiance, whispers turned to warnings. Some said Akhenaten had lost his mind, that Aten's light had scorched his soul hollow. Others, those closer to the throne, feared something worse, that it was not madness but clarity. He believed he was birthing a new world, a divine lineage, untainted by lesser blood. And so, the daughters kept coming. Akhetaten next, then Pharaoh Tasherit, each drawn into the same gilded prison, robed as queens, crowned as consorts. Their lives became ritual, their voices lost in pageantry. Even Nefertiti, his wife and queen, once revered for her beauty, began to fade into shadow. Where was she when these unions were sealed? Was she silent in agreement or silenced? The records blur, the artists went quiet. But somewhere beneath the layers of gilded stucco and sun-kissed stone, a cry still echoes, not of a wife nor a daughter, but of a child who was never given the choice. Akhenaten's city, Akhetaten, rose from the desert as a sanctuary for his vision, a city born not of mortar and brick, but of obsession. Every wall, every avenue, every towering obelisk pointed to Aten, to the light. But it was not just the sunlight that reigned there. It was his light, his rules, his bloodline. Within its gates, time warped. Day bled into night without warning. Daughters vanished behind jeweled curtains, emerging not as girls, but as goddesses, captive idols of their father's divine experiment. And beyond the alabaster facades, hunger festered. The empire crumbled beneath the golden fantasy. Fields went untended. Armies stood leaderless. The priests of Amun, once silenced, waited like coiled serpents in the dark. Akhenaten didn't see it, or he refused to, for to him, decay was beautiful. It meant the old world was dying. And if a few daughters had to be sacrificed to make the heavens real, then so be it. But darkness cannot be ruled forever. As Akhenaten aged, his grip weakened, and with it, the illusion began to unravel. His daughters, his brides, bore no male heir strong enough to carry the fire. Some died young. Others disappeared from records, their names scratched away or left incomplete. One, Kia, mother of a mysterious boy named Tutankhaten, died suddenly, her face lost to time. There were murmurs that the curse of incest had come home to roost, that the divine blood was spoiling, that gods do not wed their children, not even in Egypt. When Akhenaten finally died, his faith crumbled like sandcastles beneath a rising tide. The city of light was abandoned, silent, and it was a child, perhaps his own son by a daughter-wife, who took the throne next, Tutankhamun. But he did not continue his father's legacy, he erased it. The temples of Amun reopened. The names of Akhenaten and his brides were hacked from stone, but not forgotten. Because how do you forget screams carved in limestone? How do you silence daughters turned into wives, blooming too early under a father's sun? The tombs, the frescoes, the shattered remnants of Akhetaten speak louder than embalmed records ever could. They tell of a pharaoh who reached too far into heaven and dragged his children with him, of a city built on divine light but haunted by its own shadows, and of power, clutched so tightly that it crushed everything soft beneath it. What remains of Akhenaten is not just bones and broken idols. It is a question, lingering across centuries, terrifying in its simplicity. What does a man become when he believes he speaks for the gods? And worse, what monsters does he raise in their name? Egypt tried to bury the answer, but in every erased face, in every chiseled-out name, the truth stirs, waiting, just beneath the sand, watching. Now, centuries later, as archaeologists unearth the funerary debris of a city dreamed into ruin, the grim echoes return. Fragments of pottery speak of royal banquets where daughters sat beside fathers, not as girls, but as queens. A faded mural, buried in collapsed stone, shows a child wife holding the pharaoh's hand, her gaze frozen in painted stillness. In museums, glass cases hold relics wrapped in silence, names without faces, titles without souls. And yet the scandal clings to them all, like dust that no brush can lift. Akhenaten's legacy is not just theological rebellion or artistic revolution, it is trauma etched in limestone. It's the uncomfortable truth buried beneath every history textbook's omission. A prophet to some, a madman to others. But to those daughters whose stories were never theirs to tell, he was simply father. And beneath the golden mask of Aten's glow, that word became the most unbearable curse of all. The desert is quiet now. Vultures trace circles in the pale sky over collapsed walls and wind-shredded banners. Akhetaten is dust, Aten is forgotten. And Akhenaten, once the blinding flame of divine revolution, is a shadow, flickering weakly between pages of forgotten chronicle and stolen glory. But the silence is deceptive, because silence remembers. It remembers the hush at a wedding procession veiled in incest, the unseen tears of daughters recast as deities, the tremor in a queen's voice that history dared not record. They are not myths. They were girls, with names, with pain, with lives stitched into the folds of royal linen. And though time tried to obliterate them, they remain etched in pigment, trapped behind sealed doors, asleep beneath painted stars. Their curse was not simply their father. It was being born into a world where love and blood, power and possession, God and man, bled together until no line could be drawn. Not then, not ever. And still, we dig. With gloved hands and sharpened brushes, we unveil the sins of kings grain by grain, shard by broken shard. Every artifact we lift from Akhetaten's ruin is a whisper, a lock of hair sealed in a canopic jar, a fragment of a crown too small for a grown woman, a letter, half burned, from a princess begging for asylum in a foreign court. They can't speak, but they scream, not in sound, but in absence. in what is missing. Statues with erased faces, tombs with no names, histories rewritten with trembling hands. The story of Akhenaten and his daughters is not just about one pharaoh's madness. It is a warning of how easily power consumes love, of how devotion can mutilate. We may never know all their names, but we know enough to shudder. And in the echoing void between what remains and what was destroyed, their voices, at last, begin to rise. They rise not in protest, but in remembrance. In the slow breath of dust that lifts from shattered pillars, in the delicate patterns of jewelry unearthed beside unnamed bones, in the way a painted eye catches the light, unblinking, eternal. These daughters, once cloaked in silence, now thread through our world like ghosts in radiant linen. They reclaim their stories from the ash of empire, not just victims, not just queens, survivors of a ritual that turned love into law and blood into chains. As we attempt to stitch their fragments into history, we do not just tell their tale, we answer their long, aching question, will someone remember me? And the past, cracked open, replies, yes, because no God, no father, no chiseled order of stone can bind the truth forever. In every breathless discovery, every heartbreak of a missing name, their tragedy burns a little brighter. And we, watching from centuries away, finally begin to see. And perhaps that is the final cruelty, that their voices, once silenced by power, now echo louder than the kings who ruled them. Akhenaten wanted a legacy forged in sunfire and purity. What he left was ruin, draped in gold, a family fractured by godhood, a lineage cracked under the weight of its own divinity. His daughters were never meant to rule, only to reflect his light. But light, once fractured, refracts. It reveals more than intended. It refuses to be contained. And in that splintered glare we glimpse not just sorrow, but injustice, survival, and the slow rebellion of memory. Egypt rose again, the gods returned, but in the margins of its rebirth, these daughters endure, not as sacred brides or royal footnotes, but as the silent hearts of a warning too bright to look at directly. And in remembering them, we confront the eternal, unblinking gaze of power twisted by belief and the cost of holiness built on the shoulders of the voiceless. So the story ends in fragments, ashes held within urns no bigger than a child's fist, sarcophagi stripped of names but not sorrow. Akhenaten is gone, his sun has set, but the strange afterglow of his reign still blisters across time. In the broken mirror of his legacy, we see not just a king who defied gods, but a man who caged his own blood for the illusion of purity, and more tragically, a world that allowed it. For what is history if not the echo of choices no one dared to question? We do not mourn him. We mourn them, the daughters who became symbols, too young to consent, too precious to protect. Their stories rise like dust above holy ground, whispering warnings to any age that seeks divine perfection over human dignity. And as long as their images remain, staring from stone eyes in silent vigil, we will be forced to reckon with the truth they cannot stop telling, that faith, in the hands of kings, can be a prison carved in praise, a love that bruises, a God that asks too much. And perhaps that is how they survive, not in triumph, but in testimony. Amid shattered sandstone and fading hieroglyphs, their legacy persists in the very act of being remembered. They are the tender weights at the edge of empire, the missing lines in a hymn too painful to sing, not loud, not whole, but eternal. And as we stare into the hollow sockets of erased statues, or stumble upon a pale shard bearing a girl's name, abruptly ended, we inherit their sorrow. We are called to witness, not just their suffering, but their dignity, their enduring presence, trapped in time yet trembling with life. They teach us what history tried to smother, that silence is not absence, that pain leaves fingerprints, that no illusion, no religion, no kingdom built on the backs of children can stand against the patient, relentless touch of truth, and that somewhere beneath the sand, they are still waiting to be named. And now, the wind shifts, not just through the crumbling ruins of Akhetaten, but through us, the ones who dared to look back. As modern hands piece together what time tried to bury, each revelation feels sharper, closer, more human. A child's footprint preserved in ancient dust, a ceremonial comb carved with loving precision, the shattered base of a statue once thought to depict a goddess, now suspecting it was just a girl, beloved and doomed. These are not relics of royalty. They are echoes of lives interrupted. Akhenaten sought immortality through control, through bloodlines, through defiance of the gods. But it was his daughters who achieved it, not through temples or tombs, but through the unbearable weight of their story, a weight we now carry, silent no longer, unnamed no longer. In letting them speak, in giving breath to their memories, we remind the world that history is not what was written by kings, but what still trembles in the hearts they tried to erase. And it is in that trembling, that fragile flicker between dust and memory, where the daughters of Akhenaten find their afterlife not through myth, but through truth. Their faces, though erased, stare back at us in every uncovered mystery. Their pain gently ripples through the golden sarcophagi once paraded as triumphs, and we feel it, not as scholars or servants of curiosity, but as witnesses to a past that dared to speak through silence. The Pharaoh who married his daughters tried to seal his world in eternal sunlight, but it is their shadow that endures. A lineage of girls chained by their father's divine vision now reclaim their names in the hearts of those who remember. The sands may shift, the palaces crumble, and the gods come and go. But as long as we ask what price was paid for Akhenaten's dream, their voices rise not in chains, but as a chorus solemn, eternal, and unforgivably human. So now, the final image. A tomb wall half collapsed, sunlit through a crack in the stone. Painted across its faded surface is not a battle, nor a pharaoh's triumph, but a girl with open hands, reaching not upward, but outward, not to the heavens, but to us. Her gaze, long rubbed thin by wind and time, still pleads with a heartbreaking clarity. Do not forget me. Akhenaten is dust, Aten is silence. But she is still here. In every skeptical eye turned toward power, in every whispered name rescued from the dark. The story may close, but the reckoning never does. For history is not a lifeless archive, it is breath, trauma, memory, and in remembering these daughters, in repeating their stolen names like prayers, we give them what their father never did. Not godhood, not devotion, but dignity. And in doing so, we finally turn from the blinding sun and see them. Not saints, not martyrs, just daughters, girls who once laughed in palace gardens, whose fingers once traced the hieroglyphs on their mother's necklace. Children, folded into myths, too cruel to be holy. Their silence was not their choice, their memory, not their inheritance, but their defiance. Because in the quiet resistance of forgotten names, there is power. A power Akhenaten never understood. He believed he could rewrite the world in the image of his god, but he could not undo the human heart. And though temples fell and gods were replaced, the pulse of their story endured not as myth, not as prophecy, but as a haunting, one that walks beside us still, reminding every age what happens when power loses its reflection. So remember them, not because they were royal, but because they were real. And because somewhere, under hot sand and colder stone, they are still waiting for justice, for witness, for someone finally to see them not as echoes, but as girls. In the end, Akhenaten's ambition did not birth a new eternity, it shattered one. His daughters, once offerings to a sun god only he could see, now shine far beyond the boundaries of his failed utopia, not as reflections of his devotion, but as testaments to the cost of unmoored belief. What lingers in the dusted bones and broken murals is not divinity, but humanity too long ignored. They were daughters in life, but now, in death, they are something more. Symbols of silence broken, of power questioned, of pain transformed into legacy. It is not his name that endures, it is theirs, unspoken but unforgettable, etched into every act of remembrance. And so, as we turn from the ruins of Akhetaten, we do not leave history behind, we carry it, carved in sorrow, lit by fragile truths, and held by the enduring grace of those who never chose to be remembered this way, but are remembered all the same. So let this be the closing breath not of a tale, but of a reckoning. The Pharaoh who dared to rewrite heaven left behind no utopia, only unrest. We leave no tribute at his ruins, build no altars to his altered gods, but in the silence that follows, we hold the daughters he will never silence again. Their truth, once buried in ash and denial, now rises, unshackled by time, unchained from reverence. Each artifact, each faded mural, each unnamed tomb is not just a relic, it is a voice, fragile but unwavering. And through those voices, the foundations of blind power crack forever. Though their names may vanish in papyrus and stone, they endure in our reckoning, in our refusal to turn away. The sun has long since set on Akhenaten's kingdom, but the shadows he cast still move. And in those shadows, we find not just sorrow or memory, but a mirror, reflecting what happens when gods speak too loudly through mortal men. So if you must remember something, remember her. Not the Pharaoh, drunken on divinity, not the god Aten, now swallowed in silence, but the girl in the corridor, too young to wear a crown, too afraid to stop smiling, the sister who never spoke again, the queen who was never allowed to be a child. Remember the hands that braided her hair before the ceremony, the cracked clay disc she left behind, etched with a bird, a name we will never fully read. Remember not the myth, but the grief, not the father, but the daughters, for in their sorrowed silence lies the heartbeat of all forgotten women throughout time, those who were used, erased, sanctified without consent. Their afterlife is not in the field of reeds, it is here, in truth, in us, in every story that refuses to look away. And in that refusal, perhaps, at long last, justice becomes more than memory, it becomes mercy. So let her name, however faint or fractured, be this story's final breath, not as a monument, but as a whisper strong enough to reshape stone. Let it rise through time like incense from a tomb long sealed, curling through every silence history left behind. She is more than a victim, more than a queen. She is the child whose pain carried into eternity, a sorrow so pure it became sacred. And in telling her story, in resisting the urge to look away, we honor more than one life. We reclaim the humanity stripped by dogma, obscured by kings, and buried beneath ceremony. Akhenaten built a city for a god and filled it with daughters. But we inherit its ruins, not for his glory, but for theirs. In the echoing emptiness of empire, it is their truth that waits for breath. So we breathe, and in that breath, her voice at last becomes louder than the crown that silenced her. So we end where truth begins, not in conquest or coronation, but in a single unclaimed story fluttering beneath centuries of dust. Her name, incomplete, her voice, stolen, yet her presence, undeniable. In every museum label that dares to say unknown, in every textbook that omits the daughters of divine blasphemy, she lingers not as evidence, but as defiance. Akhenaten sought to immortalize his god, but he made immortals of his daughters instead, through pain, through silence, through the resonance of their erasure. We do not have their words, but we have their scars. We do not know their dreams, but we carry the fragments they left behind. And perhaps that is enough, enough to feel them, enough to lift them from myth into meaning, enough to remember not the Pharaoh who gave them titles, but the girls who never asked for thrones. Let their memory be the final altar built, not in gold, but in truth, shining beyond even the sun. And so, as the last grains of sand settle over Akhetaten's broken cradle, we are left not with a tale of triumph or divinity, but with a requiem, for girls who vanished into veils of gold, for voices twisted into praise, for the fragile thread of humanity stretched to breaking beneath a father's sunstroke of ambition. Akhenaten's shrines may be silent, but his daughters speak still through every absence, every fracture, every name, half remembered and desperately clung to. Their memory lies not in the grandeur of monuments, but in the quiet endurance of those who look back and choose to see them fully, not as queens, not as symbols, but as children betrayed, beloved, and finally, remembered. That is the power they could never wield, yet now possess. A story that will not sleep, a truth that will not fade, and a burden that falls, gently and forever, upon all who dare to remember the ones history tried to forget. So this, finally, is the grave of truth, shallow, wind-blown, and still warm. Beneath it lie not empires, but the tender remains of those withheld from history's embrace. The daughters of Akhenaten, once swallowed by silence, now endure in every soul haunted by injustice, cloaked in ritual, every heart broken by love, turned cruel through divine decree. Their afterlife does not shimmer in gilded chapels or celestial hymns, it lives in our gaze, held steady, refusing to flinch. They are not gone, they are not erased. They are the quiet rise of breath, just before grief, the stillness left after a name is whispered and lost to the wind. So remember them not because they shaped the world, but because the world forgot to see them as it tried to shape itself. And in that remembering, may we mourn, name, and love, not the God who claimed to create eternity, but the daughters who, through pain alone, became its conscience. This is where it ends, not in light or prophecy, but in the steadiness of remembrance. A girl, a crown too heavy, a silence too long. Their story is not just echo, it is seed. It takes root in every mind that dares to ask whose voices were stolen to build a legacy. Akhenaten's gods are gone, his palaces are dust, but his daughters remain, not by his design, but by ours. By choosing to speak their names, half lost, we give them the only immortality that matters, not eternal rule, but eternal recognition. No longer shadows, no longer instruments, just girls, trembling at the edge of history, waiting to be seen. And now, we see them. That is the ending Akhenaten never imagined. That is the justice he could never control. In defying the gods to make himself eternal, he made daughters who would, at last, outrun the sun. And in their story not his eternity begins again. So, if the sun must rise again, let it rise not over temples of gold or kings of shattered vision, but over memory reclaimed. Let it shine, softly, on the fragments of her laughter, the curve of a name too long unspoken, the breath of a story once buried in silence. The Pharaoh who married his daughters sought to erase the lines between love and power, but in doing so, he revealed them, startling, brutal, sharp. Those lines remain, etched into every story we tell, every silence we learn to break. And now, as history turns once more toward its buried daughters, we carry not just their sorrow, but their legacy, a legacy forged not in stone, but in the unyielding truth of witness. Let the final silence not be one of forgetting, but of reverence. Let it say, you lived, you mattered, and though your father named you queens, we remember you first and forever as daughters. And so, dust settles over the wounds of empire, but not over memory. We close the story not with triumph, not with finality, but with a breath held across time, fragile and enduring. Akhenaten's sun has long since burned out, but from its ashes, something brighter rises. Understanding, grief, reckoning. Each girl he crowned, each child he claimed, now stands not in shadow, but in full view, illuminated not by Aten's sun, but by our refusal to let silence win. Let this be what remains, not scripts carved by kings, but names spoken with love, not the grandeur of a god's design, but the quiet miracle of remembering a daughter. The Pharaoh sought to write his eternity in stone, but we, at last, write theirs in truth, softly, unforgettably. And so, as history turns its final page on Akhetaten, we do not see a god, we see her. And that, beyond all crowns and temples, is the legacy that endures. And in that final gaze, locked forever in pigment, barely clinging to stone, we understand why this story had to be told, not for the grandeur of antiquity, but for the quiet agony buried beneath it. Her eyes do not accuse, they ask. Who will carry my memory forward? Who will name what was left unnamed? It is not Akhenaten's god that survives, nor his monuments, nor even his dream. It is her, the unrecorded daughter, reaching through time with nothing but a glance and a silence too loud to ignore. Through her we remember them all. They are not echoes of a lost civilization, but the living heartbeat of truth unburied. So let her image be our closing, patient, eternal, and human. The Pharaoh who made gods of daughters may have ruled with sun and silence, but she leaves us with one final, wordless prayer, not to be worshipped, only to be seen. And now we have seen her. She stands alone now, not as an artifact, not as a symbol, but as the unblinking memory of all that was lost. Her story is no longer veiled in incense and marble, but etched in the quiet courage of remembrance. The Pharaoh, who married his daughters, has faded into the dust of disbelief, but she, this girl, this daughter, endures in every heart that refuses to turn away. Let history mark its final pause here, not in glory, but in grace. For in every silence broken, every name reclaimed, we build something stronger than a kingdom, a reckoning made sacred. And as her image fades once more into shadowed stone, she does not disappear. She waits, not for offerings, not for praise, but for truth, carried forward not by kings, but by us. This is not the end. It is the beginning of remembering rightly, of seeing with eyes wide open, and of honoring not the God who demanded all, but the daughter who asked only to be seen. And so, where sunlight once blinded and silence once reigned, a new light emerges, not divine, but resolute. It does not come from the sky, nor from the altars of forgotten gods, but from us, from every open eye that chooses to witness, from every trembling voice that dares to say her name. The Pharaoh is gone. His monuments crumble. But the daughters he tried to bind in gold have broken free in memory. They walk with us now, invisible but unyielding, in every historical truth reclaimed from the shadows. This is the final reckoning, not of dynasties or deities, but of dignity. Let the last word be hers, whatever it once was, or might have been. For in that word, carried forward like the hush before dawn, lives the only immortality that matters, not carved by kings, but spoken by those who remember. And in remembering, we do what no God ever asked. We finally see her. And as our final breath draws near, with time falling silent around these shattered stones, we leave not with the name of a pharaoh, but with the gentle, echoing presence of a girl who dared nothing but to exist. Her memory is not gilded nor crowned, but layered in the fragile defiance of being remembered at all. No monument stands for her, no hymn sings her name. Yet in every quiet awe struck beside a tomb, in every tear born from understanding the cost of power misused, she lives again, not as royalty, not as myth, but as a child who weathered a god's ambition and rose, piece by piece, through the very history that tried to forget her. And that is the legacy no crown can erase: endurance through remembrance. As we walk away from Akhetaten's ghost, let her be what we carry. Not the sun, not the silence, but the girl who waited and was finally seen.